Good morning. How's everybody doing? It's good to see you. It looks like we have a few people in class today, about 7 of you. Thanks for attending live. I appreciate your coming today on the second day of the personality chapter. How's everybody doing out there in TV land, in YouTube land, I should say? Check in if you want to and say hello in the chat board. Good morning, Luke T. It's very good to see you. Do we have anybody else here who wants to say hello? My voice is feeling a little bit rough today. Mariam, very good to see you as well. Thanks for coming today. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Looks like we have a good crowd in here. Okay. Well, thanks for showing up today. We're going to finish up chapter 13 today. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So, on Monday, I talked about, I introduced the idea of the self and what we think of as the self. And then I talked about where personality comes from, how it develops. Okay, so today we're going to talk about personality testing. How exactly do we measure this thing called personality? And that'll be the focus of today's lecture. Hello, Kira. Hello, Caitlin. Thanks for showing up. Now, for this week's discussion board, I've given you a couple of personality tests to take. A projective personality test called the TAT, the Thematic Apperception Test, and a self-report test called the Big 5 Personality Test. I hope you take advantage of those tests to learn a little bit about yourself this week. And then in the discussion board, let us know what you've learned from your personality test. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, measuring personality. And I'd like to go ahead and say hello to Salah Al-Khatib. Thank you very much for showing too. Wow, what a great audience today. Thanks for coming. So what we're covering today, we're going to introduce the trait approach. We're going to talk about Hans Eysenk's biological trait theory, the Big 5 personality trait theory, and then we're going to talk about the difference between self-report and projective personality tests. That's okay. I'm glad you decided to come, Saleh. We are always glad to have visitors whenever they can come. Hopefully you watch the recordings of the videos when you get a chance to. But we are glad to have you today. And hello, Whitaker. How are you doing? Whitaker, you asked about my background on some of the recorded lectures. That was actually a green screen that I was running, and I had a Carolina Tar Heel blue background. I've decided to go with a more natural background of my office these days, but occasionally I do throw up the green screen and give myself a fun background. Good morning, Bula. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So the trait approach. Back in the early days of personality, a fellow named Gordon Allport was the first person to sort of pioneer the study of personality. He sort of introduced the trait approach, which is a method of studying personality that is interested in describing what personality looks like. People from the trait approach are interested in creating tools or personality tests that measure individual differences, okay? And they do this by trying to ask the question, how is everyone like you? So what sort of traits do we need to describe everybody in the population? How are some people like you? That is, what are groupings of personalities that we can make up? And how is no one like you? How are you a unique person? And Gordon Allport started by looking in the dictionary. If you think about it, words are how we use to describe personality. And so he looked in the dictionary and he discovered that there are thousands of words that describe personality. Happy, sad, calm, extroverted, introverted, persnickety, unctuous. I don't know if you ever heard those words before, but there are lots and lots of words that can be used to describe personality traits. And he sort of organized personalities into 3 levels of personalities. Now, He argued that some people have cardinal traits, which are super strong identity defining traits that dominate your personality and define who you are. Not everybody necessarily has a cardinal trait, but you can think of some people for whom some sort of action or belief or behavior just encapsulates everything that they are. Now, maybe this is dated, but Michael Jordan, the famous basketball player, is known for being super competitive. So you might say that his cardinal trait is being competitive. Or Mother Teresa, you might say that her cardinal trait is kindness. Now, according to Gordon Allport, not everybody had cardinal traits. Cardinal traits were really super strong personality defining traits that some people have. All right. Now, he argued that all of us have what he would call central traits, which are general traits that we all have to some sort of degree, like the level of extroversion you have, the level of agreeableness you have, the level of conscientiousness that you have. And he argued that we could develop tests to measure each and every one of these traits on all people. And so we could ask the question, how are some people like you? And then he argued that you could think of a third class of traits, which are what he called peripheral traits. And these were more limited personality traits that only appear in certain situations. So maybe you're an honest person, but whenever you play board games like Monopoly, you cheat a little bit, right? Now, are you a cheater in general, or do we see cheating in all of your behaviors? No, it just sort of pops out in certain situations. So the father of the trait approach, Gordon Allport, suggested we can think of traits. He started to conceptualize traits by looking at the dictionary and traits in the dictionary. And he argued that some people had cardinal traits, real strong traits that defined them and made them unique from everybody else. That we all had a set of traits he called central traits, and that most of us have personality traits that we only demonstrate in certain situations called peripheral traits. And so he sort of started this idea of trying to develop ways to measure these personality qualities. I'd like to stop real quick and say hello to Fan Nguyen. Thank you for showing up today. Now, let's talk about making a test. There are two ways you can make a test. You can start from a theory. This is what I think personality is, and you can develop a test to measure your theory. Or you can just start asking questions and figure out what the test looks like after the fact. And this is the difference between data-driven versus theory-driven tests. So some people prefer the data-driven approach. And in fact, the Big Five test that you took is a data-driven test. So what they did was they gave people lots and lots of situations to answer about themselves. Do you typically do this? Do you typically do this? Do you typically do this? They then used a statistical technique called the factor analysis to figure out that there are 5 sort of clusters of personality. The people who developed the Big Five didn't have these ideas of personality styles to begin with. Instead, they just asked people a bunch of questions, used a statistical technique, and realized that there were 5 groupings of personality traits. That's what we call a data-driven approach. On the other hand, some people use what's known as the theory-driven test. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, but that was based on the theory of Carl Jung. So Carl Jung developed a theory of what personality was, and the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs test, was developed to measure the theory that had already been created. And that's what we'll call a theory-driven approach. You start from a theory or an explanation of personality, and then you create a test to measure the constructs in the theory. Now, your book talks about one early personality test that was a theory-driven test. And this was developed by Hans Isaac, and it's called biological trait theory. And it was based on early research into temperament, which is biologically based personality. So infants within a couple of days of life will already start to demonstrate basic personality differences. Now, since this isn't mature personality, we don't call it personality, we call it temperament. but little babies will demonstrate individual differences within days of being born. And they tend to be, some babies tend to be shyer and less exploratory than other babies. So some babies like to seek out stimulations, and some babies are afraid of stimulation. Okay. And then some babies tend to be more emotionally stable than other babies. So some babies are primarily happy, and some babies cry a lot. You can see these temperamental differences early in life. And you know what? You can think of these sort of temperament differences as being based on biological aspects of this system. So the reticular system, the reticular activating system in the brain, is sort of a system that allows you to seek out stimulation. It's your activation system. And some people have more sensitive reticular activating systems, so they need less stimulation to become optimally active. And some people have less sensitive reticular systems, and they need more stimulation to achieve the proper level of arousal. And then if you remember, we talked about the limbic system in the amygdala as being your emotional center. Think of some people as having more sensitive amygdalas, that is, their emotions are easier to ignite than other people's amygdalas or limbic systems. And so Hans Eysenck thought that this was a great way to think about personality. He argued that people were emotionally stable or unstable, and they were either extroverted or introverted, and these were based on biological differences of their personality. And so you can think of this as sort of two dimensions, if you will. So he developed the first test of personality to measure what he called extroversion and emotional stability. And he developed a personality test that would identify these different kinds of qualities. And if you look at the chart right underneath me, you'll see sort of this model that he developed. And so you can think of people who are optimistic. They may be people who are emotionally go through ups and downs, and they're also extroverted. And so they're sort of more optimistic or excitable or restless or impulsive or touchy. And so you can think of people who are emotionally unstable and extroverted as having these sort of personality characteristics. On the other hand, some people are emotionally stable and also introverted. And you can think, and you might describe these people as being calm, careful, reliable, passive, even-tempered, peaceful, or controlled, all right? And so he argued that we should think about these biological systems as creating personality, right? Now, the problem with a theory-driven approach, when you don't go from the data, is sometimes people can poke holes in your theory. And after he developed this test, people said, hey, wait a minute, this test doesn't measure people who are antisocial, psychopaths. Where does this theory describe people who commit violent acts of crime, people who steal and rob and murder? And so he realized that his theory had been limited, and he left out an important dimension of personality. So after the fact, he added in a third dimension to his personality, his biological trait theory, which he called psychoticism or restraint. And you can think of criminals as having low restraint. They just follow their impulses and do things that are often bad. Or some people have high constraint. They have high degrees of self-control, and they can control their impulses. And he suggested that this might even be related to testosterone or dopamine producing systems. So the advantage of developing a test based upon a theory is you kind of have an idea of what personality may look like, and you can tie it into some prior knowledge that the field has gathered, like Carl Jung's theory of personality or Hans Eysenck's biological trait theory. The problem with the theory-driven approach is if the theory is shown to be limited or incorrect, then that sort of impugns your personality test. So that's one way to develop a personality test. Right? Now, there is some research to suggest that maybe Hans Eysenk's biological theory is correct. So the reticular activating system, we didn't talk about this in chapter 2. This is more of an advanced brain structure. But there's this bundle of neurons that run up through your brain stem. They go from down below your pons all the way up to your thalamus. And these bundle of neurons are called your reticular activating system. And they act as a filter, allowing you to either become aroused or not aroused. If your reticular activating system needs a lot of stimulation, then maybe parts of your brain aren't stimulated by low levels of stimulation. On the other hand, some people have very sensitive reticular activating systems, and very little arousal causes their brain to become activated. Now, if you'll remember when we talked about motivation several weeks ago, I talked about optimal arousal theory. And I argued to you that people function best when they are at the appropriate level of arousal. If you're not aroused enough, you're bored, you don't focus, you don't try hard enough, and you don't do well. On the other hand, if you're super duper nervous and freaked out and too emotional, you can't function well either. So most human beings tend to operate best in what we would call a level of optimal arousal. And sports psychologists spend their times trying to help athletes maintain the appropriate or optimal level of arousal. If you get too freaked out in front of 50,000 fans, you're not going to be a very good quarterback or a very good soccer player or a very good golfer. On the other hand, if you're not fired up and excited enough, you won't perform at your tip-top performance. And research has shown that there are people who list themselves as extroverts and introverts. You can think of introverts, extroverts, and introverts as having different levels of need for arousal. And so extroverts' brains, their reticular activating systems, tend not to activate as quickly as introverts' reticular activating systems. So there may actually be biological support for this idea of a brain-based theory of personality. So higher base activity of the reticular activating system is associated with increased introversion. So if you have people take personality tests and a person scores as an introvert, and then you look at their brain using a positron emission tomography scale, a PET scan, what you'll see is that their brain, their reticular activating system, is more active than a person who scores as an extrovert. So are any of you extroverts out there? How many of you are introverts out there? Let me know. Do you prefer lots of stimulation or a little bit of stimulation? It might be related to your level of extroversion or introversion. Okay, now, a second strategy for developing a personality test is characterized by the Big 5 personality test, which you took, which you will take, I should say, for Thursday's discussion board. And this uses what's known as the data-driven approach. Okay, let's stop back. Let's go back for a minute. So Omar says he's an extrovert. So what that might mean is you have a less sensitive reticular activating system, Omar, and so you need more stimulation to maintain the appropriate level of arousal. Remember, nobody likes to be terrified and nobody likes to be bored. Those are opposite ends of the arousal spectrum. We all like to have the appropriate level of arousal. So Omar, your brain needs more stimulation for you to be optimally aroused, and that's why you are an extrovert. You seek out extroverted, you seek out more stimulation. On the other hand, we have Luke and Miriam saying that they're introverts. So what that might mean is that your reticular activating system is more sensitive. You need less stimulation to achieve optimal arousal. So again, while Isaac's biological theory shows you that sometimes a theory can have it wrong or be incomplete, and we might need to adjust or throw out the theory, the research supports, to some degree, Hans Isaac's biological-based theory. Now, we're contrasting that with the Big Five approach. Now, in the data-driven approach, what you do is you don't start out with a theory. Instead, what you do is start out by measuring personalities of different people. You measure enough people, and then you begin to get an idea of what the groupings of personality look like. And so McCrae and Costa, the developers of the Big Five personality test, basically took hundreds and hundreds of questions, and they would ask people to answer these questions. So, do you like going to big parties? From a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being no, not at all, and 5 being definitely. Answer that question. Do you feel like people are out to get you? From a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all and 5 being yes, completely. You find it easy to agree with people. Scale of 1 from not at all to 5, yes, very easily. And what you do is you get hundreds and hundreds of questions and have people take them and give you their data. You then use a statistical technique called factor analysis or cluster analysis. And what that does is that tells you if so-and-so, if Omar scores high on this question, which other questions does Omar score high on? And we look at all of these items and see if there's a similarity in this cluster of items. So we ask Miriam to take those tests, and we say, you know what, if Miriam scores high in these questions, what other questions does she score high in? And what we do is we look for patterns or clusters of items that tend to stick together for people. And in the Big Five, and then you try to interpret or name these clusters. And so McCrae and Costa used a statistical technique to come up with a personality test that's very, very popular, known as the Big Five test of personality. And what they argued was that you can interpret these clusters into 5 groups. And these 5 groups are listed below me. Openness to experience is your willingness to be interested in the world around you, new ideas, and your own emotions. Some of you, if you scored low on openness to experience, you might be what we call a conventional person. You might say, hey, the world is the way it is, and I like the way it is. Why question things? On the other hand, some of you might be high in openness to experience, and you might say, you know what, I love new ideas, and I love to think about how we could change the world. Some of you who are high in openness to experience may love art and may love creative writing. And so that's sort of one of the clusters of personality that they identified. Conscientiousness is a matter of self-control. Some of you feel like you have yourself under control. You feel like you could follow the rules. Other people tend to have trouble organizing themselves and controlling themselves. That's conscientiousness. We have extroversion. We have agreeableness, which is the degree to which you will change your opinion in order to maintain group harmony. If you're low in agreeableness, like I am, that just means that you're a stubborn person and you don't change your mind just to fit in with the group. Okay? And then there's neuroticism. And neuroticism is the degree to which you suffer 2 negative emotions, anxiety and anger. Okay? I happen to be a neurotic person. I am a very emotional person. I get nervous a lot, and I definitely lose my temper a lot. So I am a neurotic person. On the other hand, my wife is completely not neurotic. She is emotionally stable. In fact, it makes me mad sometimes that she is so unflappable. You can never make her nervous. You can never make her uptight. It is really hard to make her mad. So we're kind of different on that personality trait. So I hope all of you take the Big 5 personality test this week and find out how you rate on these 5 personality traits. Now, we compare people on these trait clusters, and when you get your scores this week, you're going to get a score that gives you a number from 0 to 99, which tells you how you compare to the rest of the population. So if you score a 50 on a personality trait, that means you're exactly in the middle. So if you score a 50 on extroversion, that means you're in the middle in terms of extroversion. You're more extroverted than 50% of the population, which means you are less extroverted than 49% of the population. If you score on the low end of the spectrum, so if you score a 20 on extroversion, that means you're more extroverted than 20% of the population, which means you're less extroverted than 80% of the population. I happen to score a 70% on neuroticism, which means I'm angrier and more emotional than 70% of the population. So when you look at your scores this week, interpret them using these numbers that you are given, because they're comparing you to your compadres. Now, when you take the test, you'll notice that what they do is they ask you for your gender, your age, and your country of origin. Because if we're going to compare people on personalities, we have to compare people with similar others. So I am a 51-year-old man, so it wouldn't make sense to compare me to a 14-year-old female. People in different countries, personality is culturally determined. That is, there are some things you can do in one culture that you can't do in another. So it's inappropriate to compare me with somebody from the Congo or somebody from Lebanon, because I might act in a culturally inappropriate way. So this test compares you with people who are similar in age, similar in gender, and also similar in country of origin. And have any of you taken the Big 5 personality test that I have for the discussion board this week? Now, while I wait for an answer, I'll go on and talk a little bit about genetics and personality. One of the first, when psychologists started measuring personality, one of the first questions that appeared was, is personality a result of your environment, or are people born that way? Miriam, well, go ahead, tell us, do you have anything to share with us, Miriam? What is your personality? So it turns out that my oldest son, Christopher Jr., has a bad temper. And I've often wondered, does he have a bad temper because he saw me get angry and emotional and it caused him to become that way? So in that case, I would feel bad about being a bad father. Or is he overly emotional and has a bad temper because he has my genes? Behavioral genetics is the field of science which is interested in trying to understand how affected by genetics some behavioral traits are. And when we talked about intelligence and IQ tests, behavioral geneticists tried to find out how much of our IQ was created by our genetic material and how much was affected by our environment. The same thing can be done with personality traits. Miriam is a neurotic personality too. Do you have a bad temper, Miriam, or are you an anxious person? Because there are two ways to be neurotic. You can be anxious and you can be angry. Don't worry about it. You just have to learn to meditate and get over it. Okay? So, now in behavioral genetics, what they do is they assess the heritability traits by comparing people who are differing levels of genetic similarity and then measuring them on important characteristics or characteristics of interest. In this case, it would be personality. So what I might do is compare you with your parents, with whom you're 50% genetically similar. I might compare you with your regular siblings for whom you are 25% similar. And I might compare identical twins who supposedly share 100% identical genetic material. And research on identical and fraternal twins. So fraternal twins are twins that come from two different eggs that are fertilized by two different sperms. And identical twins come from the same egg fertilized by one sperm that splits after it's fertilized. So identical twins share 100% genetic material, and fraternal twins share 25% genetic material. So what you do is you give personality tests to pairs of fraternal and identical twins, and then see how much their personality scores correlate. And if you look at the chart that I have here on the screen, what you're going to notice is that there's a much higher correlation between identical twins for personality traits than there are for fraternal twins. So for openness to experience, identical twins have a correlation of 0.6 on their personality scores. Fraternal twins have a correlation of 0.2. And you'll see conscientiousness shows the same correlation difference. Extroversion shows the same correlation difference. Agreeableness shows the same correlation difference. And neuroticism shows the same correlational difference. So what this suggests to us is that there is a genetic component that is measured by these personality tests. So Miriam, I don't know if you have a brother or a sister, but how similar or different are they on you when it comes to temper? Maybe you have a bad temper and they have a good temper. Now, the interesting thing about these tests is they've measured identical twins in different situations. So some identical twins are raised together, and for a very few set of identical twins, they are raised apart. Maybe their parents died and they were separated and sent to foster homes. And it turns out that identical twins raised apart are more similar than identical twins raised together. And more importantly, if you measure twins at different age periods, it turns out that when you measure identical twins as children, their personality scores aren't as similar as they are as when they become adults. So adult twins are more similar on personality scales than are younger identical twins. Why do you think that twins show this difference? So identical twins raised apart are more similar than identical twins raised together. And why do you think identical twins are more similar when they get older than when they are younger living at home together? Anybody have a theory on why that might be the case? That's interesting. I'll wait for a comment before I give you the answer. I have a good theory, but I'm going to wait for you to make your guess. Now, adoption studies in which you compare people who are genetically dissimilar but raised in the same environment show that environment has very little influence on personality. So non-genetically related siblings show no correlation on personality traits, and adopted children show no correlation with parents on personality traits. Okay, Omar can't think of a theory, but let me give you this theory. If you're raised in the same household, children love to be different from one another. They love to be unique. And so I would argue that identical twins probably try to act a little bit differently when they live at home, because there's pressure to differentiate yourself from your sibling. I'm not like my sibling, and I want to be unique. So when we're living at home, right, we may actually act a little bit different in order to distinguish ourselves from the sibling that we see each and every day. But when we move out of the house, or when we're not raised with that sibling, there's no pressure in the family to differentiate ourselves and be a unique person. So maybe it might be that when you bring that the effect that environment does have on personality is siblings sometimes feel a little pressure to differentiate themselves from their other siblings, right? Just because, how many of you have siblings and have argued or gotten mad at your parents because they treat you just like they treat your sibling? And you're like, I'm not my sibling, I'm different. But the upshot here from this chart is that genes seem to play a much stronger part in determining personality than the environment does. And in fact, you might even say the environment plays very little, if any, role in determining personality. Now, how does our personality change as we get older? Right, they do, because their parents may dress them similarly. I remember I had a pair of twin friends in school, and their parents named them Kenny and Denny. You know what I mean? So parents may get a kick out of the fact that they have twins and try to make them more similar. But I'll bet you when they get back home, Marion, they probably differentiate themselves in front of their parents. But you do bring up a very good point. Now, how does our personality change as we get older? Does it change at all? Well, it turns out personality really starts to crystallize in our mid to late teens, okay? So really, personality can fluctuate quite a bit as we're in our early childhood. But as we get older, it tends to crystallize. Now, here's the crazy thing about personality. Do we change as we get older? Yes, we do, and no, we don't. Okay? Here's the crazy thing. As we get older, in an absolute sense, our personality does change. And if you look at the chart over on the far left-hand side of your screen, what you'll see is that in 3 international samples, German people, British people, and Czech people, as people got older, their conscientiousness increased. And your parents are more conscientious than you are, and you're more conscientious than your younger brother or sister is. As we grow up, we tend to get more conscientious. So in an absolute sense, comparing you to your younger self, your personality changes. However, if you remember when I talked about the Big 5 personality test, I suggested to you that your personality is compared to people of the similar age. Now, since we all get more conscientious as we get older, as we all get less extroverted as we get older, as we all get more agreeable as we get older, you stay the same compared to your peer group, if that makes sense. So, I'm a 51-year-old man. I am more agreeable than I was as an 18-year-old. Okay, so in an absolute sense, I've become more agreeable. But compared to all my 51-year-old friends, I am still just as disagreeable as I was compared to them when we were 18. Does that make sense to everyone? So once we start measuring personality with these tests, we can start asking the question, is it nature or nurture? And how do people change as they get older? Okay, now, one thing I did not mention to you, the Big 5 approach, the Big 5 is what's known as a self-report test of personality. I asked you, hey, when you go to parties, do you like to go to big parties? Do you get angry easily? Do you find it hard to agree with people who have a different opinion? I'm asking you to report how you feel, okay? That's what's known as a self-report testing strategy. Does that make sense? That's a self-report testing strategy. Now, the problem with a self-report test of personality is that people can lie, especially if you sort of get an idea of what I'm asking about. So if I say, do you find it easy to agree with people? You might really say, no, I don't find it easy to agree with people. However, I know that will make me look like an unhappy person. So I'm going to lie. So there are different ways to test personality. In self-report tests, you ask the person to tell you exactly how they feel. How do you behave? How do you usually behave? How did you behave in the past? How would you behave in the future? Or I might even give you a list of adjectives and say, which of these adjectives describe you? Now, the advantage of a self-report is it's very direct. Who knows you best than you, right? And it's easy with these tests to compare people to one another. The problem with these tests is sometimes people don't know how they would respond. I might ask you a situation you've never been in before, and you might say, I don't know how I would respond. Or the test, you might say, well, it depends on certain situations. And the test question is too rigid for you to tell me exactly how you feel. And you know what? Some people just freaking lie. They just don't want to tell the truth on these tests. So a second testing strategy is to use what's known as a projective test. And the idea of the projective test is you give somebody an ambiguous stimulus, have them describe it, and then try to guess their personality based on how they respond. This is what's known as a projective test of personality. And the idea is that people will project their needs, motives, and conflicts into an ambiguous stimuli. Here's a projective test I use in my seated classes. On the first day of class, as students walk in the door, I say hello to each and every student. I notice some of my students say hello to me and even introduce themselves. Some students will say hello but won't really look me in the eye. And some students don't look at me at all and go all the way back to their seat and sit down and keep their head down. I can tell based on how you respond to me in the hello test as to whether or not you're an extroverted person. The people who are extroverted will say hi to me and sometimes introduce themselves. The people who won't look me in the eye or talk to me, I can tell they're introverted. Now, I didn't have to ask them if they're introverted. I just gave them a situation and looked at how they responded. And that's what's known as a projective test of personality. Now, to give you a contrast to the self-report test of personality, I've also asked you to take a projective personality test called the thematic apperception test. Okay, and basically what this is it gives you a picture of a scene, and I ask you to write a story about the scene. It's two females in a lab, and based on the story you write, I try to guess what type of personality you have based on the words you use in the story you tell. Now, the advantages of this test is it's harder to fool this test because it's not obvious what I'm looking for. And also, you can respond in any way you want, which gives you more flexibility rather than asking you to describe how you would respond in a new situation on a 5-point scale. The only problem is some people say that these tests aren't reliable, and it's hard to really measure personality accurately using these personality tests. I'd like to take a couple of moments just to show you the very famous and the oldest of personality tests, which is called the Rorschach personality test. How many of you have ever heard of the Rorschach personality test? It's sometimes called the ink blot personality test. Developed by a fellow named Herman Rorschach way back in the early 20s. He accidentally spilled a pot full of ink and noticed that the ink blob looked like something. Now, if any of you have ever been outside on a pretty day when there are clouds in the sky and tried to guess what the clouds look like, you, in a sense, have tested yourself using the Rorschach methodology. The Rorschach test is 10 slides, 5 black and white and 5 color slides, where we ask people to make a guess as to what the ink blot represents. Can anybody tell me what this ink blot looks like? Now, I will tell you that when I teach this class in the nursing department, most of my nurses see a pelvis. Can anybody see a pelvis in this picture? Right? If you think about it, now why would nurses see pelvises? Because that's what's on their mind all day long. What do you folks see? Can anybody tell me what they see? Does anybody see a mask, a monster, a winged feature? Absolutely, right? Some people see a moth, What about this picture right here? I see two bears playing patty cake. Kevin saw a moth on picture number 1. Absolutely. I see two ladies cooking something in a pot. Ooh, a jet. Oh, I see that. I see that, Kevin. You're focusing on the white part. That is definitely a jet. Absolutely. Bunnies. Omar sees two hands pressing together right here. What about this right here? Does anybody see maybe an elephant? I see a biker. You're looking at a guy sitting on a motorcycle from the front view. I see that's the tire, and these are the 2 feet. Almost a peacock, okay. I bet everybody sees a moth here. To me, this looks like a cat. To me, this looks like a cat that was run over by a car. Hope that doesn't mean I'm sick or twisted or anything. Some creature swimming downwards. Okay, I could see that. I could see that. What about this? Anybody see something? A whistle or a chain. Ooh, that's a good one, Salah. That's a real good one. And ball. Okay. I see 2 Indian princesses. Here are their feathers. Here are their heads. And here are their hands. And they're sort of doing a crazy dance away from one another. A stingray. Good one. Is that this one, a stingray? Okay. A jaw. Okay, I could see that, Omar. I definitely see a jaw. Okay, so this is what's known as a projective test of personality. So, what I want you to know for today is that Gordon Allport was the father of personality testing and argued for cardinal traits, central traits, and peripheral traits. Now, there are 2 ways to make a test up. You can start with a theory, or you can let the data tell you what. You can start with a theory and try to measure that theory using measure that theory, or you can start with the data and let the data tell you what the personality test should be. I want you to know that there's a strong genetic component to personality tests, and that personality does and does not change as we get older. And then I want you to know there are 2 types of personality tests. There are self-report tests that ask you directly about your personality, and the Big 5 is an example of that. And then I want you to know that there are projected personality tests, which give you an ambiguous stimulation and try to guess your personality based on how you respond to the ambiguous stimulation. And the thematic apperception test and the Rorschach test are examples of those. Okay, that's all I have to say for today. Does anybody have any questions before I let you go? Thank you very much for showing today. I appreciate everybody staying for 47 minutes. You've been a great crowd. Don't forget to do your discussion board, which is due tomorrow night. And if you want to share your personality tests or want me to help you interpret your personality test, I would be more than happy to do that. Otherwise, have a great day. Have a great week. And I look forward to seeing you next Monday. Take care.